There is a saying in aviation that goes something like, a good landing is one you can walk away from, and a great landing is one where you can use the plane again. It is, grim. It's a bit of dark humor that is really popular, I think because it's also disarmingly carefree about something that can be terrifying and difficult. The quote is shared widely, but I think oftentimes it gets misinterpreted as flippant gallows humor rather than a commentary on doing landings safely rather than impressively. A good landing is something we're all striving for, but if you consider the vastness of circumstance and what we're really dealing with when talking about landing an aircraft, it's nearly impossible to quantify. It's also worth noting that that quote is widely credited to Chuck Yeager, famous test pilot who was the first person to break the sound barrier. This was a guy who had more near-death experiences in the 1940s and 50s than the entire cast of the OA, and who's also quoted as saying that the reason he's such a good pilot is because he hadn't accidentally killed himself during a test flight yet. So no, I'm not convinced that that quote is about taking a careless approach to landing as it is about focusing on doing it safely. And if we're going to talk about how to land safely, there is a lot to cover. Before the section on landing in stick and rudder, Langewiesche basically admits that he doesn't want to waste much paper explaining takeoffs and turns because he thinks you're basically smart enough to figure it out, but then he goes on to say that landing is hard enough that he's got to dedicate the next 90 pages talking about it. As I've explained in previous episodes, Langewiesche wrote this book at a time well before most universally accepted teaching doctrine, and certainly before a lot of technology existed to facilitate the science of landing an airplane. But the concepts he goes over remain true today, albeit with quite a bit more fail-safes, usually. So before I go over the more fine-tuned stuff, let's establish what landing actually entails in the broadest possible strokes. We already know that you control pitch on an airplane by going faster and slower, and what landing is, really, is just a very finely controlled reduction of power and subsequent descent with a spot on the ground to which you are aiming. What I'll do in this episode is show you a few tips and tricks to aim your descent better, and to point out a few creature comforts that didn't exist in Langewiesche's time that will help you out. Once we get close enough to the ground, I'll show you how you should practice actually setting the thing down on the runway, at least good enough to proverbially walk away from it and use the plane again. From there, as always, practice will cover the rest. So first off, I think it's important to set up a lay of the land, so to speak, to provide you with some perspective. I'm flying here at 1,000 feet above sea level, and just like if you were standing on the ground, you can see the horizon is still right at eye level. This does not change no matter how high you go until you go into orbit. So let's go ahead and climb a little bit higher just as a further demonstration. Okay, so it is a little bit cloudier up here, but we're at 4,300 feet and you can still see that the horizon is straight ahead in straight and level flight. I'm showing you this because the horizon will provide a pretty crucial reference point for ground targets when flying visually. Provided your pitch doesn't change all that much, the horizon will always stay at the same point, but fixed points on the ground will always move relative to where you are. When applying this logic to landing, the idea is that if you are pitched correctly, a point on the ground will remain at the same point relative to the horizon for the entire descent. If you see your target slipping too far below the horizon, it means you aren't descending steeply enough, and if your target gets closer to the horizon, you've gotten too low. So just ahead of us, a little bit below the horizon, you can just start to see the beginning of a runway. If you could imagine like a compass rose surrounding us vertically, like we were in a Halo from one of the Halo levels or something, and we used the horizon as the starting point, I would venture to guess that the start of that runway is about 3 degrees below the horizon. And just as an aside, and this is a really broad generalization, but most aircraft on a stabilized descent can really only descend on a slope of less than 10 degrees, and most published approach plates use a glide slope of only 3 degrees. So from where we are now is a pretty good starting point to begin our descent. So we've got our spot on the ground that we're aiming for, that we can reach realistically. What do? Well, there are all kinds of mnemonic quick maths that they teach you that you can do to calculate exactly how fast you should be going or how many feet per minute you should be trying to lose. But if you know this horizon trick and you've got a pretty good eye for that sort of thing, you can take all those devices and just throw them in the garbage where they belong. All you really need to do is make sure that the point you're aiming for remains at the same distance below the horizon while trying to keep your speed and rate of descent pretty stable. Or as stable as you can realistically keep it until you get close enough to actually land the thing. And if you've done this correctly, once you get close enough to land, you'll see that the spot that you are aiming for is the same distance below the horizon, and you're in pretty good shape. Now, at this point, you may be saying to yourself, Snacks, you spent all of last episode talking about V-speeds. Isn't there just like a V-speed for landing that we can utilize so we don't have to listen to your flat, listless voice? And okay, that's fair, but the V-speed conversation for landing is much more complicated. There are some V-speeds to consider here, but they exist more like brackets within which to operate rather than something to explicitly aim for. Remember, the idea is to gradually reduce both speed and altitude until you get to the ground, so there can't really be a one-size-fits-all speed to aim for. Sure, there's a best glide speed that will tell you what speed to go to glide the furthest if your engines fail, gear down speed for when you should, and there's always the VY speed that we covered also a stall speed, climbs episode that you could, and all of this is really technical stuff that, for the purposes of this episode, I don't think that we need to go over. You should get into the habit of trying to maintain a steady rate of descent and a steady speed during your approach, but that all kind of gets thrown out the window once you get to the final stages of landing. And if you're focusing on minutia like V-speeds when you're only a few hundred feet off the ground, you're vulnerable to overcorrecting, which at that stage can prove deadly. And I will give examples of it, but I just want to show off a few more things about the approach phase before we get into that. Okay, so you've cruised unobstructed up until the point where the runway is in full view, and at this point, you're too close for the horizon trick to really be of any use. Assuming you aren't landing on some grass strip in the jungle or something, most paved runways worth their salt will have a few nav aids to help you out. Right now, at least in the United States, there are 3 primary ones. I'm going to show you all 3 and how to use them, but they're all thankfully very similar and intuitive, but, if you don't know what they are, they'll just sort of get ignored. So, the first 2 are essentially identical, and you'll find them just off to either side of a runway. The first one, which you can see here just off to the right of the runway, is this array of lights, a front row and a back row. It's called a VASI, or a Visual Approach Slope Indicator, and the way it works is really simple. It'll show you a combination of red and white lights, and they will change color depending on if you're too high or too low along the glide slope. What you want is this: red lights on top and white on the bottom. If you get too high, both sets will be white, and if you get too low, both sets will be red. Very simple, and especially helpful at night because they're bright as hell and can be seen for miles. And this next one is called a PAPI, or Precision Approach Path Indicator. It works exactly the same, where it's just an array of red and white lights, except they're laid out all in a straight line perpendicular to the runway. Same idea here though, you want to maintain 2 red and 2 white lights. 3 or 4 red means you're too low, and 3 or 4 white means you're too high. Now, if you're extra fancy and you're landing a big special jet at a busy international airport, you may be encountering something called an ILS, or Instrument Landing System. Where VASIs and PAPIs just let you know if you're too high or low, an ILS will also show you if you're centered along the runway. And although it requires ground equipment, an ILS is displayed on your avionics display. I don't feel like doing a tutorial on setting up a flight management system mid-flight because it's boring and plenty of other YouTubers have done it, so I'll just say that if you got your ILS set up in the FMS, it'll show up here on your avionics display. The glide slope indicator is here on the right, as indicated with this pink dot, and the other part, the localizer, is down here at the bottom, and it is also indicated by another pink dot. At this point, the ILS is pretty self-explanatory. You want to line up both pink dots on the middle of each axis. Once you've got things all center and center, you can pretty much ride the ILS all the way to the point where you have to land. Which brings me to the next segment, things your dumb lizard brain will tell you should do, but are bad and do not work. Okay, so let's go over an exaggerated version of a common scenario that you will likely encounter. Let's say you're on approach and you're coming in a little too low. Instinctively, you may want to pull back on the stick and go up. And this is understandable, but as you already know from episode 1, the yoke controls speed, not altitude. If you pull back on the stick, the following will happen. You will likely see an initial increase in altitude, but a subsequent precipitous drop in speed, which we all know will result in either a further decrease in altitude, or, if you remain dogged in your fight against gravity, a stall. Unfortunately, unless you power out of a glide, the lower to the ground you get, the more difficult it is to work your way out of. You're going slower, meaning controls aren't as responsive due to a lack of relative wind, which is why you should always land into the wind, but that's for another episode. If you want to save a low approach, the way to do it is to preserve relative wind and sharpen the angle of attack by going against your instinct and pointing the nose down. You'll lose some altitude at first, but you won't lose any speed, and you'll be able to extend your glide by quite a ways. Again, this is a really exaggerated example, and much too low to the ground to be realistic, but I really want to hammer home how common this is and point it out in case you were wondering why you haven't been able to finish out your glide as accurately as you were further away from the runway. It's a lot less nerve-wracking if you're coming in too high, but the same logic mostly applies. If you point the nose down, you'll lose some altitude, but you'll end up either going too fast to land properly or not build up enough speed and be unable to recover from the sinking effect. What you need to do is keep your rate of descent steady, but completely lower engine power and utilize your flaps to increase the angle of attack. You'll lose both speed and altitude more quickly without compromising the glide by pointing the nose down. You may also need to pitch up just a little bit, but know that this may result in a harsher reduction in speed and subsequent loss of control. Now that we've gotten to the last bit where we actually put the wheels down, well, if you've done everything correctly, you should just be able to coast down smoothly onto the asphalt, and there's actually a fun bit of physics here that makes landing smoother than you'd have guessed. There's a common adage you'll hear flight instructors say that goes something like, you land the plane by preventing the plane from landing, or something like that, but what they mean by that is that you shouldn't force the wheels down when you think the plane is ready to land, because the plane will come to the ground when the physics of flight don't allow it to fly anymore. Sometimes this gets translated as just holding off on hitting the ground until the plane stalls out, but that's honestly pretty harsh and you shouldn't do that. What they mean is that when you're this close to the ground, there's this neat ballooning effect caused by the downwash of the wings, which I actually showed off in episode 1 with the cloud example, and this is also the same effect that allows for takeoff. Where I'm going with this is that if the relative wind is still powerful enough to sustain flight, putting the wheels down will essentially just result in another weaker takeoff, but just kind of get manifested as this little bounce. This is bad, and you don't want this. What you do want to do is to hold off on the landing until this ballooning effect dissipates itself. Once the desire for the plane to take off is gone, it will land pretty much all by itself. There is obviously so much that I left out of this episode. Again, what I tried to do in this and every other episode is to provide some tools and to dispel some myths that will allow you to understand some of the more mystifying mechanics of flight and be able to practice them. Flight Sim allows you to pick pretty much any runway on Earth and begin a flight just a few miles out, which provides a pretty seamless and custom proving ground with basically any variable accounted for. Obviously, I highly encourage you to do this. Hopefully, these concepts will make sense in practice, and after some exhibition, you'll be able to pull them off in more and more complicated scenarios. Oh, and make sure to keep the cockpit volume up so you hear the landing gear warnings. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.